My parents left a wrapped box on my doorstep with one warning: don't make a scene. Then they drove off. I opened it and nearly dropped to my knees. Trembling, I dialed 911. Minutes later, my husband stepped inside, saw the officers, and turned pale. Please don't tell me. They actually did it. My name is Maya. I am 34 years old. If you have ever been shattered by people who should protect your peace, let me know where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe because you will want to see how I destroyed their perfect illusion. Growing up as the scapegoat in a prominent church family, I was used to my parents' cruelty. My parents, Pastor Thomas and Helen, cared only about their flawless reputation, and my sister Chloe. But nothing could have prepared me for their depravity last Thursday afternoon. 3 days before our Sunday cookout, I found a box on my welcome mat wrapped in gold Christmas paper. This was strange considering it was July. I carried the heavy box inside. An envelope was taped to the top. I recognized my mother's looping cursive immediately. It was the same handwriting she used to forge my college rejection letter, redirecting my tuition money to Chloe's academy. I unfolded the note. Maya Trent made a financial miscalculation. He needs a $5 million loan. We know you have the credit to co-sign. Sign the forms and bring them Sunday. If you refuse or tell Marcus, I will flush this box's contents down the drain. Remember your place. Chloe's husband Trent was a finance broker with a white savior complex. He delivered microaggressions about my real estate business, oblivious that my house flipping was a front for my private equity firm. I ripped the wrapping paper away. My breath hitched in my throat. The world tilted on its axis. Inside sat a small marble urn. It was the urn containing the ashes of my stillborn son, Julian. 5 years ago, we laid him to rest in the family's private crypt at the church cemetery. My parents had unsealed the heavy stone vault and stolen my dead child's remains to use as collateral. They literally dug up my baby to save Trent's career. A normal person might have collapsed to the floor in hysterics. I did not shed a single tear. The searing, blinding pain in my chest instantly crystallized into absolute freezing rage. The time for crying over my family's emotional abuse was officially over. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed 911. My voice was completely steady when the dispatcher answered. I need officers at my residence immediately. I am reporting a grave desecration, theft of human remains, and extortion. The police arrived in 10 minutes. As I was showing the two officers the extortion letter and the urn, the front door clicked open. My husband Marcus walked into the foyer after a long shift at the hospital. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the police officers in our kitchen. Marcus is a brilliant surgeon who faces life-or-death situations daily with absolute calm. But in that moment, all the blood drained from his face. His briefcase slipped from his grip, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud thud. Maya! He choked out, his voice cracking with a horror that mirrored my own. Please don't tell me. They actually did it. Tell me that is not Julian. It's him, I replied, my voice a hollow echo in the quiet kitchen. My mother left him on the porch like a package. Marcus stumbled forward, wrapping his arms around me in a crushing embrace. I could feel his chest heaving as he stared at the urn. The officers looked profoundly uncomfortable, processing the sheer malice of the crime. Ma'am, we are taking this note as evidence, the older officer said gently, slipping the demand into an evidence bag. We will send a unit to the church cemetery to confirm the vault was breached. A detective will be reaching out to you shortly. Just as the officer finished his sentence, my phone began to vibrate on the counter. The caller ID flashed Mother. I looked at Marcus. He nodded, his jaw clenched tight. I answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so the officers could hear every word. Maya, darling. My mother's voice trilled through the speaker, dripping with that fake church lady sweetness she perfected over 30 years of playing the pastor's devoted wife. Did you receive my delivery today? I received it, Mother, I answered, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. Wonderful, she chirped happily. I expect to see you and Marcus at the cookout this Sunday. Do not forget to bring a nice, expensive pen. Trent has all the paperwork ready. We are wearing our Sunday best, Maya. Do not embarrass us. I wouldn't dream of embarrassing you, I said coldly. I will be there, and I will bring everything that is required. Good girl. She snapped, the sweetness dropping for a fraction of a second. See you Sunday. The line went dead. The officers stared at the phone in shock. They had just heard a woman casually confirm her extortion plot over a Sunday barbecue invitation. We have everything we need, the officer said quietly, tipping his hat before they walked out the front door. Marcus turned to me, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. What are we going to do? I walked over to my heavy leather briefcase sitting by the door. I unzipped the main compartment and slid a discreet digital audio recorder into the side pocket. Then I pulled out a thick, red legal portfolio containing corporate acquisition documents that Trent and my parents knew absolutely nothing about. We are going to a cookout, I told my husband, zipping the briefcase shut with a sharp, decisive pull, feeling an unfamiliar but deeply satisfying sense of absolute control over our future. And we are going to burn their entire kingdom to the ground. The driveway of my parents' sprawling colonial estate in an exclusive Atlanta suburb was choked with luxury vehicles. Pastor Thomas and First Lady Helen Williams were holding court on their pristine back lawn, surrounded by the most influential and wealthy members of their megachurch. I gripped the handles of my ceramic casserole dish, a cherished recipe I spent hours perfecting while Marcus carried my heavy leather briefcase. The moment we stepped onto the flagstone patio, the suffocating atmosphere of my childhood enveloped me like a thick fog. Women in wide-brimmed hats and men in tailored linen suits turned their heads, their judging eyes scanning my simple sundress. My mother spotted us immediately. Her smile, previously warm and inviting for church elders, instantly hardened into a tight, practiced grimace. She marched across the lawn, her heels sinking slightly into the grass, and snatched the glass dish from my hands before I could even say hello. She held it up away from her body, as if it were contaminated. "Maya, what on earth is this?" she asked. Her voice was deliberately loud, carrying across the manicured lawn to ensure maximum audience participation from the choir directors and deacons. "I told you we were hosting the church board today. We cannot serve homemade casseroles. It looks incredibly cheap and unrefined." She turned dramatically toward a massive, professionally arranged buffet table. "Look at what your sister Chloe brought. A fully catered, imported seafood spread from the executive chef at Le Bernardin. That is how you present yourself to polite society. This looks like a charity donation." She dropped my dish onto a side table near the trash cans with a clatter. I did not flinch. I just smoothed the fabric of my dress and offered a serene, impenetrable smile. "I will be sure to keep your standards in mind, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly level. The digital audio recorder hidden in my pocket was already picking up every single word. Before Marcus could speak up to defend me, a shadow fell over our conversation. Trent, my sister Chloe's husband, sauntered over to us. He swirled a glass of expensive scotch, the ice clinking rhythmically, wearing an expression of unbearable smug arrogance. Trent had always treated our predominantly black family gatherings like a sociological experiment where he was the enlightened observer. "Maya Marcus," Trent drawled, stepping uncomfortably close to my husband. "Glad you managed to make it. I hope you brought a working pen." He took a slow sip of his drink, looking me up and down with barely concealed contempt. "Listen, Maya, I know you have been hustling out there with those little fixer-upper houses in the bad parts of town. It is cute. It really is a nice little hobby for you. But the adult world of high-level finance is moving incredibly fast, and you people really need to learn how to keep up to build generational wealth. I am offering you a massive lifeline today." I stared at him, keeping my expression entirely blank. "A lifeline, Trent." He chuckled, a wet, condescending sound that made my skin crawl. "Yes, Maya. Financial leverage. It is a complex concept your community notoriously struggles to grasp. You all tend to hold on to bad debt instead of leveraging your assets for growth. I need $5 million to cover a temporary liquidity gap in my Vanguard fund portfolio. You are going to sign a second mortgage on that little house of yours and co-sign a commercial loan I prepared. In exchange for your signature, I will give you a generous 2% cut of the recovery. That is more cash than you make painting walls and fixing toilets all year long. Consider it my good deed for my wife's family." You sign the paper, I save my fund, and you finally get a taste of real money. Marcus stepped forward, his broad shoulders shielding me from Trent's condescending smirk. Trent, back away from my wife right now. If you honestly think we are leveraging our home to bail out your absolute incompetence, you are out of your mind. The jazz music playing on the patio speakers suddenly seemed to stop. Conversations across the lawn abruptly halted. Pastor Thomas, my father, materialized beside Trent like a thundercloud, his face flushed with sudden explosive fury. He pointed a thick, heavy finger directly at Marcus's chest. "You do not raise your voice to Trent in my house," my father boomed. Church elders physically turned their bodies toward us, their eyes wide with gossip-hungry anticipation. My father made sure his deep baritone voice resonated across the entire yard. "Trent is actually doing something significant with his life. He brings prestige and real money to this family. What do you bring, Marcus? Absolutely nothing but disappointment and average wages." Maya was on track to graduate from Dartmouth. She was going to be a high-powered corporate lawyer. She was going to be somebody important in this city. Instead, she shamed this entire family by dropping out of the Ivy League to marry a broke, struggling medical student who could not even afford a proper engagement ring. I stood my ground, refusing to let him break me. I chose to build a life with a man who actually respects me and works hard to save lives, Dad. I shot back, keeping my voice cold and steady. My father laughed bitterly, a harsh sound that echoed off the brick exterior of the house. "You threw away a top-tier education to become a glorified construction worker. You paint houses while your sister Chloe sits on prestigious charity boards. You are 34 years old, and you have absolutely nothing to show for your life except a ruined credit score and a mediocre marriage in a tiny house. Trent is giving you a chance to finally be useful to this family for the first time in your life. You will sign the papers he prepared right now, Maya. You owe us for the embarrassment you have caused this family name." The sheer audacity of his speech hung heavily in the humid summer air. My father was entirely convinced of his own righteous authority, completely blind to the actual reality of the situation. He genuinely believed I was the broken, destitute daughter, begging for a scrap of validation from her betters. He thought the heavy briefcase Marcus held contained nothing but financial anxiety and a cheap pen. I looked at Trent, still smirking securely behind his Scotch glass, then at my mother, who was crossing her arms in silent, judgmental agreement, and finally at my father, whose chest puffed out with arrogant, pastoral pride. They had set the stage perfectly. They had gathered the exact audience I needed. They wanted a public submission, a complete surrender of my dignity to save their golden child's husband from his own greed. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth metal of the recording device, ensuring the green light was still blinking. The trap was meticulously set, and they had walked right into it, completely unaware of the destruction about to follow. Helen clamped her manicured fingers around my upper arm, digging her nails into my skin as she forcefully guided me toward the French doors, leading into the heavy estate kitchen. She made sure to greet the passing church deacons with a radiant, saintly nod, keeping up the flawless packaging of a pastor's devoted wife, until the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind us. The immediate silence of the kitchen was suffocating, thick with the smells of roasted garlic and maternal betrayal. Helen spun around the mask of the First Lady, instantly melting into a mask of pure predatory calculation. She reached into her massive leather designer handbag on the marble island, pulling out a small velvet pouch containing the remaining fragments of my stillborn son's ashes. "You think you can play games with me, Maya?" Helen hissed, her voice dropping into a vicious low whisper that vibrated with malice. She rattled the velvet pouch right in front of my face, the soft sound hitting my ears like a physical blow. "I know you called the local precinct from your porch. The sheriff is a loyal deacon at our tabernacle, sweetie. His deputies are not going to arrest the woman who funds their youth programs over a family dispute. You are going to sign those mortgage documents today, or I swear to God, these ashes will be scattered across the interstate before the sun goes down." I stared at the velvet pouch, my lungs burning, as I forced myself to breathe through the overwhelming tide of fury. You desecrated Julian's resting place, Mother. You violated a cemetery vault because your white golden boy cannot manage his hedge fund. Helen snorted defensively, tossing her head back with absolute entitlement. Julian is dead, Maya. He has been gone for 5 long years, and crying over a grave is not going to pay the property taxes on this estate. Chloe is currently pregnant with a living child, a beautiful baby boy who deserves a legacy. Trent needs that $5 million to clear his name before the federal regulators audit his firm next month. Chloe needs her husband secure, and she needs this money to preserve the life she deserves. You have always been the Q-den of this family, selfishly hoarding your little flipping business. It is time you finally sacrifice something for your sister. The kitchen door swung open, and Pastor Thomas strode inside, his heavy Oxford shoes slamming against the polished porcelain tile. He adjusted his silk tie, his face darkened by the authoritative rage he usually reserved for castigating sinners from the pulpit. He did not look at me. Instead, he pulled a thick manila folder from beneath his arm and slammed it onto the marble island right next to my mother's handbag. "Your mother is being entirely too patient with you, Maya," Thomas barked, his voice booming in the enclosed space. He flipped the folder open, revealing a stack of forged internal hospital inventory logs and heavily altered surveillance screenshots. "I spoke with the chief executive of Marcus's surgical department this morning. These documents show an alarming discrepancy in the hospital's narcotic vault, specifically pointing to your husband's signature. I have fabricated an unassailable paper trail accusing Marcus of stealing high-dosage prescription painkillers from his own operating room." Marcus stepped through the door, his face twisting with disgust as his eyes scanned the forged hospital logs. "You are a minister of the gospel, Thomas. You are actively inventing a felony charge to destroy my medical license." Thomas leaned over the island, his gaze drilling into Marcus with absolute venom. "I am a protector of my kingdom, young man. In the city of Atlanta, my word is law to the medical board. If Maya does not sign Trent's commercial loan guarantee within the next 60 seconds, I am personally hand-delivering this file to the Federal Narcotics Division. Your career will be completely dead by nightfall. You will be stripped of your surgical credentials, blacklisted from every hospital in the country, and spend your 30s rotting inside a federal penitentiary. Sign the papers or your husband pays the price." I looked at the forged files, then at my mother, who was casually tucking the velvet pouch of my son's ashes back into her handbag with a triumphant smirk. They genuinely believed they had boxed us into a corner. They thought their holy reputation and fabricated evidence gave them absolute dominion over my life. They had no idea that my private equity firm had spent the last 6 months quietly buying up the distressed debt of Thomas's megachurch, or that I already held the keys to their entire financial empire. Marcus reached for my hand, his palms sweating, but his grip unyielding. "Maya, don't do it. We will fight them in court. We will expose the forgery." "We don't need a courtroom, Marcus," I whispered, my voice dropping into a cold clinical register that made my mother's smirk falter for a fraction of a second. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen my father had placed on top of the manila folder. I turned toward the wooden doors, my heart beating with the slow, rhythmic cadence of a soldier entering a battlefield. "Let us do this right here in front of everyone." I pushed the kitchen doors open, stepping back out onto the sun-drenched flagstone patio. The chatter of the church elders instantly died down as I marched toward the main table where Trent was currently standing, loudly bragging to the senior deacons about his upcoming yacht trip to the Greek islands. He froze as I approached, his eyes instantly tracking the gold pen clutched tightly in my right hand. "Well, well, look who finally decided to join the adults," Trent sneered, setting his scotch glass down on the white linen tablecloth with a soft thud. He adjusted the cuffs of his designer shirt, looking at me with an expression of supreme victory. "I knew you would see reason, Maya. It is just business after all. Let us get your signature on these loan guarantees so we can all go back to enjoying Chloe's beautiful seafood spread." Trent pulled a thick sheaf of legal documents from his perfectly tailored blazer, snapping the rubber band off with a dramatic flourish. He spread them out on the wrought iron patio table, smoothing the heavy bond paper with a satisfied exhale. The church elders who had been pretending not to eavesdrop visibly leaned closer, eager to witness the financial salvation of their beloved pastor's daughter. Trent clicked a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen, holding it out to me like a scepter. "Right here on the dotted line, Maya," Trent instructed, his voice projecting across the lawn. "An initial the bottom of page 4. It's a standard commercial loan guarantee. You are leveraging the equity in your home to secure a $5 million line of credit for my Vanguard portfolio. In exchange, I am offering you a very generous 2% yield once the market stabilizes. I am literally pulling you out of the working class today. You should be thanking me." He practically shoved the pen into my chest. The sunlight glinted off the silver barrel, reflecting the absolute certainty in his eyes. He fully expected me to crumble to submit to the overwhelming pressure of my family's fabricated authority. My father stood behind him, arms crossed, nodding his approval. My mother watched from the kitchen door, clutching her designer handbag, ensuring the performance proceeded exactly as she had directed. Chloe stood beside Trent, her hand resting protectively on her slightly rounded stomach, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips. I took the pen from Trent's outstretched hand. I did not speak. I did not argue. I leaned over the wrought iron table and smoothly signed my name on the final page of the document. I flipped to page 4 and initialed the bottom margin. Chloe lunged forward, her diamond bracelets clinking as she snatched the signed documents off the table before the ink was completely dry. She held the papers up to her chest, her eyes blazing with triumphant vindication. "It is about time you learned your place in this family, Maya," Chloe sneered, her voice carrying a venomous edge she rarely exposed in front of the congregation. "You have always been so stubbornly independent, always trying to prove you were better than us with your little house-flipping projects. But when push comes to shove, you are nothing without the protection and guidance of the people who actually know how the world works. Trent just saved you from a lifetime of painting baseboards. You should be grateful we even allow you at this cookout." I slowly capped the silver pen and set it down on the table with a soft click. I adjusted the strap of my leather briefcase on my shoulder, letting the silence stretch for a few uncomfortable seconds. I looked at the church elders, then at my father, and finally at Trent, whose triumphant smile was already beginning to slip. I casually checked my watch, tapping the glass face with my index finger. "It is currently 2:15 on a Sunday afternoon. You really should have read those documents more carefully, Trent." Trent frowned, his brow furrowing as he reached to take the papers back from Chloe. "What are you talking about? They are standard loan guarantees. My legal team drafted them." "Your legal team drafted a standard corporate authorization form," I corrected, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost bored tone. "But you didn't check the specific corporate entity you listed as the primary guarantor. You listed Vanguard Holdings, LLC. That is my fund." Trent snapped, a hint of unease finally creeping into his voice. "I am the managing director. You are co-signing as a secondary asset holder to provide liquidity." "No, Trent," I replied, shaking my head slightly. "You were the managing director of a subsidiary branch. Vanguard Holdings, LLC, was fully acquired 2 years ago by Apex Capital Management. My signature on that specific corporate form as an unauthorized secondary party attempting to authorize a massive transfer of funds for a subsidiary director triggers an automatic security protocol." Trent stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "What security protocol?" I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that I had been saving for exactly this moment. "You do realize my signature on that specific corporate form doesn't authorize a loan, right? It authorizes a federal asset freeze." The color drained entirely from Trent's face. He snatched the papers from Chloe, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with frantic desperation. "You are bluffing. You don't have the authority to freeze anything. You flip houses." "I own Apex Capital Management, Trent." I stated, the words falling like heavy stones onto the patio. "I bought 51% of Vanguard's shares through a blind trust 24 months ago, when your initial liquidity issues first began to surface. You are not a brilliant finance broker. You are an employee of my firm, And you just attempted to execute a fraudulent $5 million transfer using forged collateral documents. The silence on the patio was absolute. The soft jazz music seemed to fade into the background. The church elders stared at me in stunned disbelief. My father's commanding posture deflated, his mouth hanging slightly open. Chloe looked from me to Trent, her smug smile entirely erased, replaced by a dawning, panicked comprehension. "That's a lie," Trent stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "That is an absolute lie. You cannot own Apex. You dropped out of college. You are a contractor." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick red portfolio. I dropped it onto the wrought iron table, the heavy thud echoing across the silent yard. "I dropped out of an Ivy League program because my father ruined my credit score by taking out secret credit cards in my name to fund Chloe's pageant career," I said, looking directly at Pastor Thomas. "I couldn't secure student loans, so I learned to code. I built algorithmic trading software, sold it to a hedge fund, and used the capital to start flipping commercial real estate, not residential houses. I built a private equity firm from the ground up, while you all sat around this patio mocking my dirty fingernails." I tapped the red folder. "This portfolio contains the complete acquisition records for Vanguard Holdings. It also contains the internal audit my team completed last week. An audit that flagged your $5 million liquidity gap as a direct embezzlement scheme designed to cover your offshore gambling debts." Trent stumbled back, hitting a patio chair, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking violently as he scrolled through his contacts. "I'm calling the bank," he muttered, his eyes wide with terror. "I'm calling the director. You are insane. This is a complete fabrication." Trent's fingers fumbled violently against the glass screen of his smartphone. He stabbed the keypad, his breath hissing through clenched teeth, and slammed the device onto the center of the metal patio table. He hit the speakerphone button with entirely too much force. The rhythmic electronic dialing tone echoed across the silent lawn, amplifying the suffocating tension gripping the church elders. My parents stood completely frozen, the arrogant bluster draining from their faces as they watched Trent completely unravel. "David, pick up the phone," Trent muttered, his eyes darting frantically between the glowing screen and my calm expression. "Pick up the damn phone." The line clicked open. A heavy sigh crackled through the tiny speaker. "Trent." The voice of David Sterling, the regional bank director, filtered into the humid afternoon air. He sounded incredibly tired. "I was just about to call your personal cell. We have a massive problem." Trent grabbed the edge of the table, leaning over the phone as if he could physically intimidate the voice on the other end. "Listen to me, David. There is a crazy woman here claiming she froze my Vanguard accounts. Tell her she is out of her mind. Confirm that the $5 million transfer from the church accounts just cleared to cover my liquidity gap. Tell them everything is fine." "I cannot do that, Trent," David replied, his voice painfully clear. "The transfer was blocked at the highest level of our security matrix. Your access credentials to the Vanguard portal have been permanently revoked. You are completely locked out of the trading floor, the corporate accounts, and your personal corporate credit lines." Trent turned a ghostly shade of gray. He looked at Chloe, who was suddenly clutching her stomach, her designer dress looking entirely too large for her shrinking posture. "What are you talking about, David? Revoked? By who? I am the managing director. You cannot freeze my funds without a direct order from the majority shareholder. The majority shareholder just froze the fund and flagged your entire portfolio for severe embezzlement," David stated flatly, ignoring Trent's rising panic. "Federal authorities have already been notified. Security is currently boxing up your office." "What shareholder?" Trent screamed, his voice cracking into a shrill, desperate pitch that made several deacons physically take a step back. "Apex Capital is a blind trust. No one even knows who owns the controlling stake. Who authorized this freeze?" "Your boss," David answered, the finality in his tone echoing like a gavel striking wood. "Mrs. Maya Williams." The call disconnected. The dial tone buzzed loudly in the center of the table until Marcus calmly reached over and tapped the screen, cutting the sound. The patio went dead silent. The jazz music had completely faded away, leaving only the sound of a distant lawnmower and the sharp intake of breath from the gathered congregation. Beside the massive stainless steel grill, the heavy metal barbecue skewer slipped from my father's trembling hand. It clattered against the stone patio, rolling toward the edge of the manicured grass. Nobody moved to pick it up. My mother. Helen stood paralyzed near the kitchen doors. Her hand was still buried inside her designer bag, her fingers likely still wrapped around the velvet pouch containing my son's stolen ashes. Her meticulously crafted public image was shattering in real time, the pieces falling around her designer heels. You... My father choked out, his deep pastoral voice reduced to a raspy, disbelieving whisper. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute confusion. You paint houses, you wear cheap clothes, you drive a commercial van. This is a trick. Marcus must have hacked the bank. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small. I flip commercial buildings, Dad. I corrected him, my voice carrying the steady, unyielding weight of absolute truth. I wear comfortable clothes because I spend my days walking through massive commercial construction sites, directing teams of architects and structural engineers. I drive a commercial van because it hauls blueprints and material samples for my development projects. While you and Mother were busy parading Chloe around country clubs and praising Trent for losing millions of dollars on terrible stock options, I was quietly building a real estate and private equity empire. I picked up the red portfolio from the table and opened it, pulling out a glossy corporate summary. I held it up for the church elders to see. 2 years ago, Vanguard Holdings was drowning in toxic debt. Trent was making incredibly risky bets with his clients' money, including the retirement funds of several deacons standing in this very yard. The firm was going to collapse. Apex Capital Management stepped in and bought the controlling stake for pennies on the dollar to prevent a total market panic. I am the sole founder and CEO of Apex Capital. Trent sank into a patio chair, burying his face in his hands. A low, pathetic moan escaped his lips. Chloe rushed to his side, shaking his shoulder violently. "Tell her she is lying, Trent," Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "Tell them she is just a jealous, bitter dropout. We are wealthy. We are the successful ones." Trent did not look up. He just shook his head, his shoulders heaving. "He cannot tell you that, Chloe," I said, walking slowly toward my sister, "because he knows exactly what the audit in this red folder contains. He knows he wired $3 million of client funds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to cover his sports betting losses. He knows he tried to use my pristine credit and our family home as collateral to borrow $5 million to replace the stolen money before federal regulators arrive." My father stumbled forward, his face pale and sweating. "Maya, please," he stammered, utterly abandoning the absolute authority he had wielded mere minutes prior. "We are your family." "Not anymore, Dad, I swear." Helen lunged forward with a guttural shriek that tore through the heavy summer air. Her practiced composure evaporated, leaving behind a frantic, terrified woman desperate to maintain her crumbling social empire. She shoved past a paralyzed choir director, her designer heels scraping against the patio, and slammed both hands flat onto the iron table. The impact rattled the expensive crystal glassware and sent iced tea spilling over the white linen tablecloth. Her eyes were wide and darting rapidly between the stunned church elders and my calm face. "You are lying!" my mother screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill register that echoed off the brick facade. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is a sick, jealous liar. You paint walls for a living, Maya. You install drywall and fix toilets in neighborhoods we do not even drive through. You are a complete failure. You dropped out of a top-tier university to marry a broke student and live in a pathetic house. You do not own a private equity firm. You do not own anything." She turned to the congregation, waving her arms in a frantic, sweeping gesture, trying to herd the gossiping flock back into her pen of illusion. She smoothed her hair back with shaking fingers. She flashed a manic smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. She was visibly terrified. "This is just a horrible prank. Helen pleaded with the crowd, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Maya has always struggled with her mental health. She has always harbored deep toxic resentment toward her sister. She is simply having a breakdown because she cannot handle the success of Chloe. I let her finish her frantic sermon. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the weight of her desperation to settle over the audience. The church elders were not buying the performance. They were watching Trent, who was hyperventilating against a patio chair, and my father, who was staring at the ground with a look of absolute dread. The truth was already writing itself across their guilty faces. I reached into the secondary compartment of my heavy briefcase. I pulled out a massive 2-inch thick stack of bound corporate documents, bank statements, and forensic accounting reports. I did not hand them to my mother. I did not place them gently on the table. I lifted the stack and dropped it directly into the center of the lavish buffet spread. The documents landed with a heavy thud right in the middle of a crystal bowl of gourmet potato salad, sending chunks of mayonnaise flying across the imported seafood display. Helen gasped loudly, jumping backward quickly to protect her expensive silk dress from the flying debris. Those are the unredacted financial records for the last 36 months. I announced, making sure my voice carried clearly to every single deacon choir member and church elder standing in the yard. He did not just lose money in the market. He systematically siphoned over $12 million from the portfolios of his clients, and I know exactly where every dime went. I turned my gaze to Chloe, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the buffet table as if the ground had opened up beneath her feet. Trent funneled $2 million through dummy corporations to fund your extravagant lifestyle, Chloe. I stated, my tone analytical and merciless. He paid for your 6-month vacation in the Maldives. He bought you those diamond tennis bracelets you loved to flash during Sunday service. He covered the mortgage on this estate when the vanity projects of Dad drained the discretionary funds of the church. And speaking of Dad, Trent transferred another $3 million to purchase the fleet of imported luxury cars for Pastor Thomas. You have all been living like royalty on stolen money. The murmurs rippling through the crowd instantly transformed into loud, angry gasps. Men in tailored suits began pulling out their phones, their faces hardening with sudden, furious realization. These were the exact men who had entrusted their retirement accounts to the management of Trent. They were realizing that their hard-earned wealth had paid for the luxury vehicles of the pastor and the designer wardrobe of the First Lady. The carefully constructed facade of Trent completely disintegrated. The arrogant, condescending smirk he had worn like a shield for years vanished entirely. The mask dropped, exposing the terrified, pathetic criminal hiding beneath. He turned a sickening shade of gray, the color completely washing out of his face. He looked physically ill, swaying slightly as his knees buckled under the crushing weight of reality. He had spent years treating me like a financially illiterate charity case. He had built his entire identity on the delusion of his own inherent superiority, weaponizing his position to deliver racist microaggressions about my intelligence and my capabilities. Now standing on that manicured lawn surrounded by furious investors, the absolute truth hit him with the force of a freight train. His entire financial existence, his freedom, and his future were currently resting firmly in the palms of the black woman he had spent years ruthlessly mocking. "Maya, please," Trent begged me, his voice cracking into a high nasal whine. He took a stumbling step toward me, his hands raised in a gesture of total surrender. "You do not have to release those files to the authorities. We can work this out internally. We can draft a repayment schedule. Just please do not destroy my life." "You destroyed your own life, Trent," I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You stole millions of dollars. You threatened the medical license of my husband. You allowed my mother to dig up my dead child to use as emotional blackmail. There is absolutely no internal resolution for what you have done. The federal regulators are already reviewing those files. You are going to prison, and this entire fraudulent empire is finally coming down." Chloe let out a piercing wail that shattered the stunned silence of the patio. She collapsed against the heavy iron table, deliberately knocking over a pitcher of lemonade as she clutched her slightly rounded stomach with both hands. Tears streamed down her meticulously painted face in perfect, heavy drops, her entire body shaking with violent theatrical sobs. She looked around at the church elders, her eyes wide with manufactured terror, desperately trying to elicit the sympathy she had weaponized her entire life. "You are literally killing me, Maya," Chloe gasped, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. She leaned heavily against Trent, who was paralyzed by his impending federal indictment. "The stress of your insane jealousy is hurting my baby. You are putting my child in danger because you are bitter about your miserable life. We are sisters. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You have all this money. You need to fix this right now. You need to drop the charges clear Trent's name and give us the $5 million. Do it for your future niece." Her performance was perfect, complete with ragged breathing and a strategic stumble forward. She reached out her manicured hand, her diamond bracelets clinking loudly, intending to grab my arm and force submission. Before her fingers could even brush my sleeve, Marcus stepped smoothly between us. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a sudden or aggressive movement. He simply placed his solid, imposing frame directly in her path, becoming an immovable wall between my sister and me. The cold, unyielding fury in his eyes made Chloe stop dead in her tracks, her hand hovering awkwardly in the humid air. "Do not take another step toward my wife," Marcus stated, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried absolute authority. "You do not get to invoke sisterhood to escape a federal crime, Chloe. And you absolutely do not get to use your pregnancy as a shield after the sheer cruelty you have inflicted on Maya." Chloe blinked, her fake tears momentarily pausing as she looked up at Marcus in genuine confusion. She was so accustomed to men bowing to her routine that his rejection overloaded her brain. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Chloe stammered, taking a small step back. "I have always been supportive. I am the victim here." "You are a predator," Marcus corrected, pulling a small black leather notebook from his breast pocket. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages with clinical precision. "Let us talk about your support, Chloe. October 12th, 2 years ago. Maya was in the hospital recovering from her second failed IVF cycle. You stood beside her bed and told her that God was likely closing her womb because she lacked the maternal instinct required to raise a child properly." A sharp gasp echoed from the cluster of church mothers near the hydrangeas. Chloe's mouth opened and closed silently, her face flushing a deep mottled red. "March 4th last year?" Marcus continued, his voice echoing across the silent yard like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "The day of my wife's miscarriage. You cornered her in the kitchen during a Sunday dinner. You told her she should stop forcing a pregnancy because it was clear the universe deemed her unfit, and then you demanded she help you plan your gender reveal party. You smiled while she wept." Marcus snapped the notebook shut, the sound cracking like a whip. "You have weaponized motherhood to inflict maximum psychological damage on your sister for years. You mocked her empty nursery. You paraded your fertility like a weapon. You do not get to demand her financial salvation using the very child you used to torment her. You are going to face the consequences of your actions, and neither your tears nor your pregnancy will save you from the reality of your husband's fraud." Pastor Thomas pushed his way past my mother, his face contorted into a mask of desperate, furious rage. His polished pastoral image was completely gone, replaced by the cornered animal instinct of a man watching his entire corrupt kingdom collapse into dust. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored suit pocket, his thumb hovering aggressively over the screen. "You think you hold all the cards here, Marcus?" Thomas roared, spittle flying from his lips as he marched toward us. He shook the phone in the air, his eyes wild. "You think you can come into my home, humiliate my family, destroy Trent's life, and walk away clean? I have the file right here. The disciplinary report from your residency program. The formal reprimand regarding your conduct. You think this congregation will respect a doctor with a hidden record?" The church elders exchanged nervous glances, the tension in the yard ratcheting up to a suffocating level. My father was playing his final desperate hand, attempting to restore dominance through sheer extortion. "I am sending the file to the state medical board right now, Marcus," Thomas threatened, jabbing his finger toward the screen. "I am pressing send. Your career is dead. You will lose your license, your practice, and your reputation. I will make sure you never practice medicine here again. Now tell your wife to call the bank and unlock the funds, or I destroy you right here in front of everyone." Marcus did not flinch. He did not look at the phone. He looked at me, a calm, reassuring smile playing on his lips. I stepped around Marcus, closing the distance between my father and me until we were standing mere inches apart. I looked down at the glowing screen of his phone, then up into his desperate eyes. The complete lack of fear on my face made him hesitate, his thumb freezing just above the send button. "Go ahead, Dad," I said, my voice eerily calm and very steady. "Send the file. I do not care anymore about your pathetic attempts to control my life." Thomas's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. His thumb trembled wildly, but his massive ego simply refused to let him back down in front of his flock. He jabbed his thick finger against the glass screen, bypassing his email app, and directly calling the personal cell phone of Dr. Aris, the chief administrator of the state medical board. He aggressively tapped the speaker icon, holding the device high in the air like a twisted trophy. The electronic dialing tone pulsed through the heavy summer humidity. Everyone on the patio completely froze. My mother whimpered near the grill, finally realizing the sheer magnitude of the cliff they were all standing on. "Dr. Aris," Thomas boomed the very second the line clicked open, injecting his voice with maximum pastoral authority and righteous indignation. "This is Pastor Thomas Adams. I am calling to officially submit the disciplinary file regarding Dr. Marcus Williams. As a pillar of this community, I cannot in good conscience allow a man of his highly questionable character to continue treating vulnerable patients in our city. I have the unredacted documents ready to transfer to your office immediately." A heavy, exhausted sigh echoed through the tiny speaker, cutting sharply through my father's arrogant bluster. "Pastor Thomas, we have been waiting for your call. Dr. Williams and his legal team already briefed us on your extortion attempt. The hospital's lawyers are forwarding your fake documents to the authorities." The words hung over the silent patio, striking my father with the physical force of a sledgehammer. His arm dropped slowly to his side, the smartphone suddenly looking incredibly heavy in his grasp. He stared blankly at the screen, as if it had magically transformed into a venomous snake right in his hand. The murmurs of the congregation escalated into loud, shocked gasps. "Dr. Aris, there must be a severe misunderstanding," Thomas stammered, the booming confidence entirely stripped from his vocal cords. "These are legitimate medical reprimands. I obtained them through a highly licensed private investigator. You need to look at the file before you make any rash decisions." "The file is a crude forgery, Pastor," Dr. Aris replied, his tone laced with absolute disgust and professional fury. "Marcus is our chief of surgery. He has an unblemished medical record. We ran a federal security trace on your private investigator yesterday afternoon. He explicitly admitted to fabricating those documents at your direct request, matching a template you illegally provided. The state police are currently processing the warrant for his arrest, and I highly suggest you retain criminal legal counsel immediately." The line went dead. The sharp click of the disconnection felt like the final nail being driven into the coffin of my father's legacy. The church elders erupted. Deacons who had followed him blindly for decades were now shouting, pointing accusing fingers, and physically backing away from the patio as if my parents were suddenly contagious with a deadly disease. Thomas stumbled backward, his hip hitting the edge of the brick planter box. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, terrified, and completely devoid of their usual commanding fire. "Maya, please," he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic rasp. "Tell them to stop. Tell them it is a massive mistake. I am your father. I raised you." "You raised me to be a financial sacrifice," I shot back, my voice slicing effortlessly through the chaotic noise of the ruined barbecue. I stepped closer, forcing him to meet my unwavering gaze. "You love to preach about integrity and sacrifice from your pulpit every Sunday, but you never tell your congregation the truth about how you funded your perfect family image. You never tell them what you actually did to me when I was 18. Chloe whimpered from her iron patio chair, trying desperately to shrink into the floral cushions. I did not let her escape. I gestured directly at her perfectly tailored maternity dress. "Do you remember the Miss Teen regional pageant, Chloe?" I asked, raising my voice so every remaining guest could hear clearly over the whispering crowd. Do you remember that custom hand-beaded silk gown you wore, the one that cost $12,000? You paraded across that stage, posing for cameras while Dad told everyone the church community had graciously sponsored your entry. I turned back to my father, my eyes burning with years of suppressed rage. The church did not sponsor that dress. You did, Dad. You used my social security number. You forged my signature on 3 different high-limit credit card applications the exact week I turned 18. You maxed them all out to buy Chloe's gown, her private coaching sessions, and her professional photography packages. You stole my financial identity to fund her vanity project. The elders gasped again. A senior deacon, a man who had known me since I was a little girl, shook his head in absolute disgust. My mother covered her face with her hands, finally unable to maintain the matriarchal facade she prized above all else. I was accepted into Columbia University. I continued, the bitter memory of that crushed dream fueling my words. I earned a partial academic scholarship, but when I applied for the student loans to cover the rest of the tuition, I was flatly rejected. The bank told me my credit score was completely destroyed. They said I had defaulted on $30,000 of consumer debt. I confronted you in your office, Dad. Do you remember what you told me? Thomas could not speak. He just stared at the patio stones, his chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. You told me that family requires sacrifice. I quoted, spitting the horrific words back at him. You told me that Chloe had a real chance at stardom and that my Ivy League education was a selfish, unnecessary luxury. You explicitly ordered me to drop out, get a menial job, and pay off the debt myself to protect the pristine reputation of the family. You sacrificed my entire future so your favorite daughter could wear sequins and a plastic crown. I watched him crumble completely. The great Pastor Thomas Adams, a man who had demanded total obedience and unquestioning respect from everyone he encountered, was now reduced to a trembling, exposed fraud in front of his entire congregation. The people who had revered him were now looking at him with naked contempt. You ruined my credit, I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. You forced me out of my dream school. You made me work double night shifts scrubbing commercial floors and inputting data just to dig myself out of the financial grave you maliciously dug for me. You thought you broke me. You thought you ensured I would never rise above the lowly station you assigned me. I felt Marcus step up right behind me, his hand resting firmly on my lower back. His solid presence was a grounding anchor amidst the swirling chaos of the yard. But you miscalculated, I said, a cold, hard smile touching my lips. Because while you and Chloe were busy celebrating her superficial victories, I learned how to survive. I learned how to code. I learned how to read the markets, how to build algorithms, and how to spot a fraudulent enterprise from a mile away. You threw me to the wolves, Dad, and I came back leading the pack. Trent watched my father's final extortion attempt evaporate into the humid air, his eyes tracking the invisible trajectory of his own ruined life. The regional bank director had locked him out. The federal authorities were already dismantling his office. Now the state medical board was preparing to press criminal charges against his relative for fraud and extortion. The protective bubble of the Adams family prestige, the shield he had so arrogantly relied upon to commit massive financial crimes, had been completely obliterated in less than 10 minutes. He stood near the heavy iron patio table, his immaculate blazer clinging to his sweating back, breathing in sharp, frantic gasps, like a marathon runner who had just realized he was sprinting toward a cliff. He looked at the church elders who were actively backing away from the patio. He looked at Pastor Thomas, who was staring blankly at his dead smartphone. Finally, his panicked gaze locked onto me. The sheer terror in his eyes stripped away every ounce of his tailored, wealthy bravado. His knees suddenly gave out. He collapsed onto the stone patio, the expensive fabric of his trousers scraping against the rough brickwork. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, scrambling over the spilled lemonade and scattered legal documents, ignoring the horrified gasps of the congregation. He stopped right at my feet, clasping his hands together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of prayer. Maya, I am begging you. Trent sobbed, tears and sweat streaking down his face, completely ruining his polished appearance. You have to tell them to stop the audit. You have the power to freeze the federal inquiry. I never wanted to do any of this. I swear to God, I never wanted to take that money from the fund. It was her. He spun around on his knees and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my sister. It was Chloe! Trent screamed, his voice raw and echoing across the lawn. She never stopped spending. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain her lifestyle? The designer bags, the luxury cars, the regional pageant sponsorships, the private club memberships. She demanded a massive kitchen renovation just to outshine the mayor's wife. She maxed out my personal credit lines 3 years ago. When my bonuses dried up, she threatened to leave me and take the house. She told me I was a failure as a provider. She forced me to find the money somewhere else. I only skimmed those accounts because she gave me an ultimatum. Chloe stumbled back against the grill, her face twisting in pure, unadulterated outrage. "You lying coward!" she shrieked, gripping her maternity dress. "You are the financial manager. You made those trades. Do not you dare try to blame me for your illegal gambling debts. I gambled because I was desperate to replace the cash you burned through." Trent fired back, scrambling to his feet, his face red with frantic rage. "I tried to tell you we were drowning in debt. I tried to cut up your credit cards. You laughed at me. You told me that a man of my supposed status should figure it out. You said if I could not afford your lifestyle, you would find someone who could. You are a parasite, Chloe." He turned back to me, his eyes wide and manic, eager to trade his wife for his freedom. "Maya, listen to me. I can give you everything. I have the offshore account numbers. I have the digital ledgers detailing every illegal transaction Thomas authorized through the Church Outreach Fund. I will turn state evidence on all of them. Just please keep me out of federal prison. I will do anything you want." I looked down at the man groveling on the patio stones. "You helped my mother desecrate my home. You stood by while she stole the ashes of my son. You do not have anything I want, Trent." Trent shook his head violently, his eyes darting toward Helen, who was frozen by the kitchen doors. "I did not want to do that," he screamed, the volume of his voice silencing the entire yard. "I told them it was a terrible idea. I told them it crossed a line. It was not Helen's plan. It was Chloe's." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cicadas seemed to stop buzzing. "What did you just say?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously low. Trent backed away from Marcus, his hands raised defensively, pointing frantically at Chloe. "It was her idea," he repeated, desperation fueling his betrayal. "When we found out Vanguard was freezing my accounts, we panicked. We knew we needed $5 million immediately to replace the missing funds before the quarterly audit. Chloe is the one who remembered the urn. She knew how much you cherished it. She told Helen exactly where you kept it in the nursery. She literally said that you were weak and sentimental, and that stealing the ashes was the only way to make you pay. She said you would sign anything to get your baby back. She orchestrated the entire thing to make you pay for our debt." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the congregation. The church mothers stared at her in pure, unfiltered disgust. Several deacons physically turned their backs on the patio. The matriarchal image Helen had fiercely protected was entirely pulverized. The sheer depravity of the act, weaponizing a dead infant to extort millions, was too evil to comprehend. Chloe let out a feral, piercing shriek. She lunged forward, abandoning her pregnant, fragile victim routine entirely. She closed the distance and swung her arm with vicious force. The sharp crack of her open palm striking Trent's cheek echoed like a gunshot. The force of the blow snapped his head to the side, leaving a bright red, perfectly formed handprint across his skin. "You spineless, pathetic loser!" Chloe screamed, grabbing the lapels of his ruined blazer and shaking him violently. "You must protect me now." Trent shoved her hands off his chest with a violent jerk that sent her stumbling backward. He stayed on the ground, surrendering completely to his destruction. The chaotic noise faded into a dull hum in my ears. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled deep into my bones, freezing my blood and silencing the storm of anger that had raged inside me for years. It was no longer hot rage, it was glacial stillness. I turned my head slowly, moving my gaze from the pathetic man on the ground to the woman standing frozen by the glass doors. Helen looked like a cornered animal. Her perfectly sprayed hair looked brittle, and the expensive silk blouse hung off her frame like a borrowed costume. She clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting between me, the horrified elders, and my father, who was paralyzed by his unmasking. She waited for her husband to step up and shield her, or for the congregation to gather and rally around her. Nobody moved, nobody made a sound. I stepped away from Trent and closed the distance between myself and my mother. I walked forward with slow, deliberate steps until I was standing close enough to see the sweat forming on her powdered forehead. I did not shout. My voice was a whisper carrying the chilling weight of absolute finality. It sliced cleanly through the humid summer air, reaching every person standing on that patio. "You dug up my son for a pair of designer shoes." The words hung there, monstrous and undeniable. I watched her swallow hard, her throat bobbing against the pearls. I watched the frantic calculations happening behind her eyes as she searched for an angle, a lie, or a scapegoat. Finding absolutely none, she resorted to the only defense mechanism she truly knew: righteous, twisted indignation. "You do not understand anything about the pressure we carry." Helen snapped, her voice gaining a shrill defensive edge. She dropped her hand from her pearls and squared her shoulders, attempting to project the authority she was losing. "You have never understood what it takes to maintain the foundation of this ministry. People look up to us, Maya. They rely on us to be the standard. They expect to see the physical manifestation of God's favor. We are the leaders of this community. We simply cannot lead them if we appear broken or poor. If the congregation knew Trent was failing, if they knew Chloe was drowning in debt, they would lose faith in your father. The entire church organization would collapse." She pointed a shaking finger at the surrounding crowd. The church mothers who had previously hung on her every word now stared back at her with expressions of sheer terror. "It was a temporary solution," Helen pleaded, her voice rising. "Trent needed time to reallocate the federal funds. He needed leverage, and you were completely unwilling to help your family. You sat in your beautiful house with your successful husband and endless resources while your sister was on the verge of total public humiliation. We needed the $5 million to fix the accounts before the audit. We needed to protect the blessed image of this family. You forced our hand, Maya. You truly made us desperate." I stared at her, entirely incapable of comprehending the psychological labyrinth required to justify her actions. "You stole the ashes of your dead grandson," I stated. "You walked into my home, violated my sanctuary, and held the remains of my baby hostage because Chloe maxed out her credit cards buying luxury cars and pageant gowns. You committed a severe federal crime to protect a facade." "It was just a piece of metal," Helen shrieked, her mask finally shattering into jagged pieces. The carefully cultivated image of the pious pastor's wife evaporated, leaving behind a calculating fanatic. "It was dust. You were obsessing over dust while your living, breathing sister faced a complete collapse. We are building a kingdom here. We are doing the Lord's holy work. Sometimes the Lord requires us to make difficult decisions for the greater good of His church. God understands necessary sacrifices." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the yard, following her horrific declaration. The sheer blasphemy of her words, weaponizing faith to justify the psychological torture of her own daughter, paralyzed the remaining guests. Even Pastor Thomas looked at his wife with a mixture of shock and profound horror, finally realizing the true depth of the monster he had helped to create. Marcus stepped out from the shadow of the patio awning. He moved with a calm, predatory grace. His face was an unreadable mask of professional detachment. He did not look angry. He looked like a surgeon preparing to excise a terminal tumor. He reached deep into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and smoothly pulled out his smartphone. The screen was already glowing, displaying an active, ongoing phone call. "God might understand your necessary sacrifices, Helen," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying a lethal, quiet resonance that made my mother physically flinch. "The FBI certainly will not." He turned the phone screen toward her. The call timer showed that the line had been active for the last 45 minutes. He had been broadcasting every single word, every confession, and every single threat directly to the lead federal investigator handling Trent's embezzlement case. "Agent Miller," Marcus spoke clearly into the receiver, never breaking eye contact with my mother. You have the full confession regarding the extortion, the theft of human remains, and the wire fraud conspiracy. We are standing by. A sharp metallic voice crackled through the speaker. Confirmed, Dr. Williams. Police units are already turning onto the street. Right on cue, a sound pierced the stagnant air. It started as a faint wail in the distance, rapidly multiplying and growing louder by the second. The undeniable shriek of approaching sirens began echoing down the manicured suburban street, shattering the illusion of safety my family had so ruthlessly maintained. The flashing red and blue strobe lights violently painted the pristine white siding of the Addams family estate, signaling the abrupt, terrifying end of their reign. Tires screeched loudly against the manicured asphalt of the driveway as three separate police cruisers aggressively hopped the curb. Their heavy, thick tires tore deep, muddy trenches into the extremely prized perennial flower beds, crushing the imported pink hydrangeas she worshipped. The sheer physical reality of armed law enforcement invading her meticulously curated domain sent Helen into an absolute manic tailspin. She completely snapped, unable to process the total destruction of her flawlessly maintained social kingdom. The calculating fanatic vanished, instantly replaced by a desperate, delusional hostess trying to forcefully rewind reality. "Turn the music back on right now," Helen shrieked, her voice cracking as she wildly waved her arms at a paralyzed deacon standing near the outdoor sound system. "Everyone, please sit down, smile. We are having a wonderful summer celebration. Nothing is wrong here." She darted toward the massive stainless steel grill, her hands shaking violently as she grabbed a heavy porcelain serving platter. She piled it high with lukewarm, untouched barbecue ribs, her breathing ragged and terribly shallow. She marched directly toward me, her eyes wide, frantic, and completely unhinged by the approaching sirens. "Take this plate, Maya," she hissed through gritted, smiling teeth, shoving the heavy porcelain forcefully against my chest. "Hold the food. Look happy. You will not destroy this family in front of the entire neighborhood. You will smile and tell them we are just having a spirited theological debate. Play along right now, or so help me God." She jabbed the edge of the platter into my ribs, desperate to manufacture a cheerful family tableau for the approaching police officers. I did not raise my hands to take the platter. I simply took a deliberate step backward, staring blankly into her terrified eyes, and let gravity do the work. The porcelain shattered loudly against the stone patio, sending sticky barbecue sauce and heavy chunks of meat flying across the toes of her expensive designer heels. "The performance is officially over, Helen," I stated, my voice eerily calm as I looked down at the ruined food. "You cannot cater your way out of a federal indictment, and you cannot force me to cover your tracks ever again." Heavy car doors slammed in aggressive unison. The loud thud of heavy combat boots hitting the driveway echoed over the fading wail of the sirens. Four heavily armed officers marched purposefully toward the backyard gate, their hands resting cautiously on their dark utility belts. His powerful survival instinct immediately kicked into overdrive, refusing to accept defeat. Thomas smoothed the lapels of his wetsuit jacket, forced a stiff, practiced smile onto his pale face, and strode confidently toward the iron gate to intercept them, fully convinced his local authority could easily override federal law enforcement. He deployed his legendary pastoral baritone, the exact same rich, comforting cadence he used to extract millions of dollars in donations from grieving widows. "Officers, welcome to my home," Thomas boomed, extending a steady hand that was blatantly ignored by the approaching men. "I am Pastor Thomas Adams. There is absolutely no need for alarm or disruption today. I sincerely apologize for the sudden noise. We are simply hosting a private family gathering that got a little out of hand." "You know exactly how passionate siblings can get during a hot summer barbecue." Thomas puffed out his chest, attempting to physically block the narrow entrance to the patio. "We are handling it internally through deep prayer and familial counseling. I know the police chief personally. You boys can head back to the station now. Can I offer you some cold lemonade for the road?" The lead officer, a tall, imposing man with a deeply lined face and absolutely zero patience for suburban theatrics, did not even break his stride. He bypassed my father, ignoring his hand, his broad shoulder clipping Thomas hard and forcefully knocking the great pastor off balance. "Save the sermons, Mr. Adams." The lead officer commanded, his voice completely devoid of any respect for the carefully constructed fake local celebrity status. He stepped firmly onto the brick patio, his sharp eyes scanning the chaotic scene, quickly moving past the shattered plates, the sobbing Chloe, and the trembling Trent. He pulled a thick, folded document from his breast pocket and held it up high for the entire stunned congregation to see. The remaining church members backed away slowly, their eyes wide with fear, as the stark reality of the situation finally registered in their minds. "We are not responding to a neighborhood noise complaint," the lead officer announced, his voice carrying the lethal, undeniable weight of the law. "We are executing a joint federal and state warrant. We have explicit authorization to search this entire property, seize all digital and financial records, and make immediate arrests." He paused, letting the severe gravity of his presence sink into the humid, stagnant air. He looked directly at Chloe, who had completely stopped screaming, her perfectly painted face turning the color of chalk as she realized her massive financial crimes were finally fully exposed. "These warrants are issued regarding the targeted extortion of Dr. Marcus Williams, the massive embezzlement of Vanguard corporate funds, and the illegal exhumation and desecration of human remains," the officer finished. The specific mention of the desecrated remains hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. The few church members who had stayed out of morbid curiosity now gasped in pure, unfiltered horror, crossing themselves and fleeing toward the exits. Thomas slumped heavily against the iron fence, his pastoral facade entirely gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a man watching his corrupt kingdom completely burn. The carefully constructed illusion of their perfect, untouchable family had finally been reduced to nothing but ash. There was absolutely nowhere left for them to run, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. The truth had finally won. The crunch of tires against gravel shattered the stunned silence. Two black SUVs angled into the driveway, sealing off any escape route. The tinted windows rolled down, and four individuals wearing federal windbreakers stepped out into the stifling summer heat. They moved with a predatory efficiency that made the local officers step back. The lead agent, a tall woman with sharp features, marched directly onto the patio. She bypassed the shattered porcelain and scattered remnants of my mother's ruined feast without even glancing down. Her eyes were locked onto Trent, who was still trembling on the stones. "Trenton Sterling," the federal agent announced, her voice projecting absolute, terrifying authority across the manicured lawn. "I am Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest on multiple charges, including wire fraud, interstate embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud a financial institution. Stand up and put your hands where I can see them." Trent let out a guttural, pathetic wail. The reality of federal prison finally fractured his fragile, arrogant mind. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the spilled lemonade and barbecue sauce. He looked around wildly, calculating a futile escape attempt. He lunged to his right, attempting to bypass the local officers and sprint toward the side gate. He did not make it 3 steps. Two federal agents closed the distance with terrifying speed. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his tailored blazer, lifting him entirely off the ground before slamming him face first into the massive stainless steel outdoor grill. A thick pool of warm barbecue sauce instantly soaked into the light gray fabric of his suit. Trent shrieked in shock and pain as the agents forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking into place echoed across the yard. "I was coerced!" Trent screamed, his face pressed against the greasy metal grates of the grill, tears smearing his cheeks. "I have offshore account numbers. I have names. I can give you everything. My wife made me do it. You have to listen to me. I am a victim here." The agents ignored his pathetic rambling, hauling him backward toward the waiting black SUVs. He dragged his feet, sobbing hysterically like a spoiled child being dragged to the principal's office. Chloe watched her husband being hauled away, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. The luxurious life she had ruthlessly maintained was evaporating right before her eyes. She spun around to face me, her hands curled into tight fists. All her fake fragility was gone. "You ruined my life!" Chloe shrieked, taking a threatening step toward me, her voice breaking into a ragged scream. "You planned this! You set us up to be destroyed! You were always jealous of my marriage! You are a vindictive monster!" I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at her expensive maternity dress and the desperation burning in her eyes. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The sister I once tried to love was consumed entirely. "No," I replied, my voice steady and calm, cutting right through her hysterical screaming. "You just could not afford your own." Chloe let out a furious cry and raised her hand, intending to strike me across the face. Before her arm could even swing forward, a local female police officer stepped sharply between us, grabbing Chloe's wrist midair and twisting it firmly downward. Chloe gasped. "Assaulting a witness in front of federal agents is a highly inadvisable strategy, ma'am," the officer warned, her tone devoid of sympathy. "Step back right now and keep your hands to yourself, or you will be joining your husband." Chloe yanked her arm away, stumbling backward into a patio chair. She collapsed into the cushions, realizing her tears held absolutely zero power over the law enforcement officers currently dismantling her world. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly. Agent Miller turned away from Chloe's breakdown. She adjusted the folder of warrants in her hand and walked toward the iron fence where Pastor Thomas was slumped. My father looked up at her, his face ashen. He tried to straighten his posture, attempting to summon one last ounce of his legendary pastoral dignity, forcing a weak smile. "Agent Miller," Thomas began, his voice raspy. "I am absolutely appalled by my son-in-law's actions. I assure you the church and I had no knowledge of his crimes. We are victims." Agent Miller stopped directly in front of him. Her expression remained completely stony, her eyes boring into him with the clinical precision of a predator observing cornered prey. "We already have your full cooperation, Mr. Adams," Agent Miller stated, her voice slicing through his lies. "We have possessed the digital ledgers from Vanguard for 72 hours. We tracked the flow of the embezzled funds." Thomas swallowed hard. The faint color that had returned to his cheeks completely vanished. "We tracked the routing numbers directly to offshore accounts registered in the Cayman Islands," Agent Miller continued. "Accounts exclusively registered under your personal name and the tax identification number of your church." My mother let out a sharp gasp. The elders began whispering frantically to each other, their faces pale with shock. "You used your own son-in-law to launder stolen corporate funds through a tax-exempt religious organization," Agent Miller said, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from her belt. "You built a massive personal fortune on stolen corporate money. We also have a warrant for your arrest regarding the tax evasion linked to Mr. Trent's offshore accounts," Agent Miller stated. "We have the wire transfer logs and the forged tax returns." Agent Miller stepped forward, grabbing Thomas by the arm and spinning him around to face the iron fence. She pushed him forward, forcing his chest against the cold metal bars. Thomas groaned as she pulled his wrists behind his back. Pastor Thomas Adams, the untouchable pillar of the community, the man who demanded total obedience and weaponized faith to destroy his own daughter, was now permanently secured in cold federal handcuffs, fully exposed to the whole world as a common, pathetic little thief. The metallic clink of the locking mechanism finalized my father's ruin, but the deeply ingrained entitlement of his position refused to die quietly. He twisted his shoulders against the grip of the federal agents, his breath hitching, as he desperately scanned the horrified crowd of remaining guests. His eyes darted past the weeping Helen and the paralyzed deacons until they locked onto a solitary figure standing near the edge of the manicured rose garden. Elder Harrison, the chairman of the church executive board, had remained entirely silent throughout the ordeal. He was a stern, retired appellate judge whose immense financial contributions and impeccable moral standing effectively funded my father's entire ministry. He possessed the ultimate authority to sway the congregation and possessed enough legal connections to potentially complicate the arrest. Harrison slowly stepped forward, his silver cane sinking slightly into the soft, ruined grass. He bypassed the local police officers and approached the federal agents holding my father. His expression was an unreadable mask of weathered authority. The murmurs of the fleeing congregation ceased instantly, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Everyone knew that a single word of defense from Elder Harrison could shift the narrative, casting doubt on the federal raid and painting my father as a martyr suffering religious persecution. My father immediately recognized the opportunity. He leaned into his pastoral persona, dropping the panicked, sweaty demeanor of a cornered criminal and adopting the deep, resonant tone of a persecuted saint. "Elder Harrison, thank God you are still here," Thomas projected, pitching his voice to carry across the patio, ensuring every lingering guest heard his defense. "You must intervene. These officers are acting on entirely fabricated information. They are being manipulated by a bitter, vindictive child who has lost her way. Maya has harbored deep resentment against this family for years. She has completely strayed from the Lord's path and is now using the unfortunate financial mistakes of my son Trent to orchestrate a smear campaign against me." Thomas strained against his restraints, thrusting his chin forward to look the elder directly in the eye. He was pouring every ounce of his manipulative charisma into this final, desperate performance. "I am a man of God," Thomas proclaimed, his voice dripping with practiced righteousness. "I have dedicated my entire life to shepherding this flock. You have known me for 2 decades, Elias. You know my heart. You know my unwavering commitment to our community. Maya is weaponizing her own grief to ruin this ministry. You must vouch for my character. You must tell these agents that the church stands entirely behind its pastor and that this raid is a gross violation of our sacred institution." Elder Harrison stopped 3 feet away from my father. He looked down at the handcuffs, then shifted his sharp, analytical gaze to Agent Miller. He did not immediately speak. The silence stretched thick and suffocating as my father's confident facade began to sweat under the elder's intense scrutiny. I did not wait for the old man to make a decision based on blind faith or past loyalties. I reached into the oversized tote bag slung over my shoulder and pulled out a thick, heavy red folder. I had prepared this specific dossier weeks ago, compiling the digital ledgers Marcus had carefully extracted from Trent's frozen Vanguard accounts. I walked deliberately across the patio, stepping over the ruined barbecue feast, and inserted myself directly between my father and the man he was desperately trying to manipulate. "Before you blindly vouch for his character, Elder Harrison," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable clarity, "you should see where the church's new building fund actually went." My father's face drained of all remaining color. He violently lunged forward, restrained only by the 2 federal agents anchoring him to the spot. "Do not listen to her," Thomas roared, the holy facade violently ripping away to reveal pure animalistic panic. "She is a liar. She fabricated those documents to destroy the church." I extended my arm, offering the bright red folder to the elder. Harrison looked at my father's frantic, sweating face, then looked down at the dossier in my hand. He slowly reached out and took the folder. He opened it, adjusting his reading glasses as he flipped past the cover page. The patio was so quiet, I could hear the crisp turning of the thick paper. I did not need to look at the pages to know exactly what he was seeing. I had memorized every single line of that financial betrayal. The first section details the $8 million the congregation raised last year for the community center expansion. I explained, projecting my voice to ensure the remaining deacons heard every word. "You will see that the money never reached the construction escrow account." Page 4 shows the authorization signatures. My father personally ordered Trent to wire those specific donations into a series of highly obscured shell companies registered in Delaware. Elder Harrison's finger traced the lines of the spreadsheet. His jaw clenched tight, the muscles ticking beneath his weathered skin. Flip to page 12. I instructed maintaining eye contact with the man who had funded my mother's lavish lifestyle for years. Those shell companies immediately transferred the congregation's money into private offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. If you cross-reference the dates of those specific transfers, you will notice a fascinating coincidence. They align perfectly with the week my mother purchased her vacation home in Aspen, and the exact day my father bought his new private yacht. Helen let out a strangled, pathetic gasp from the glass doors. She covered her mouth with both hands, realizing her prized social standing was not just damaged, but permanently eradicated. The money that funded her elite status was stolen directly from the pockets of the very people she considered beneath her. Elder Harrison continued flipping through the pages, his breathing growing increasingly heavy. The profound betrayal radiating from him was extremely palpable and completely undeniable. Elder Harrison's eyes scanned the rows of highlighted transactions, tracing a decade of systematic greed. He flipped past the Cayman Island wire transfers, landing on a section labeled for general tithes and offerings. The color completely drained from his face. These were not just complex corporate maneuvers or isolated incidents of misappropriating a massive building fund. The spreadsheets detailed a meticulous weekly skimming operation that had bled the church dry for 10 years. Every Sunday, a calculated percentage of the cash dropped into the collection plates by struggling parishioners. Single mothers and pensioners had been diverted directly into Helen's private lifestyle accounts. "You stole from the widows," Elder Harrison whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of heartbreak and rising fury. He looked up, his silver hair catching the flashing blue and red lights of the police cruisers. "You stood at the pulpit, Thomas, preaching about the virtues of sacrifice and tithing. You looked those faithful people in the eye, promising them their hard-earned dollars were doing the Lord's work, while you were funneling their grocery money to pay for Helen's country club memberships and your imported Italian cars." Thomas opened his mouth, stammering, desperate to find a theological loophole for his greed. "Elias, the scripture says the laborer is worthy of his hire. We built that congregation from the ground up. We brought those people to salvation. The laborer is worthy of his reward." Helen backed away from the glass doors, her hands trembling violently. The remaining deacons and church mothers who had lingered near the edges of the patio now stared at her with open, visceral revulsion. The woman who had judged their modest clothes and critiqued their parenting had been funding her supposed superiority with their stolen tithes. Her holy, untouchable matriarchal image was dead, replaced by the ugly reality of a common petty thief. I reached into my tote bag one final time. My fingers closed around the cold, smooth metal of a silver USB drive. I held it up between my index finger and thumb, catching the harsh glare of the police strobe lights. I extended my hand toward the elder, letting the small device rest on top of the red folder. "The financial ruin is bad enough, Elias," I stated, my voice steady, ensuring every person in the yard heard the final nail in my parents' coffin. But greed was not their only sin. They crossed a line that God Himself would never forgive. And here is the security footage from the cemetery. Elder Harrison stared at the small silver drive as if it were a venomous snake. The collective gasp from the congregation rippled through the humid air again. Thomas violently thrashed against the grip of the federal agents, his eyes rolling in panic. "Do not look at it!" Thomas screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "It is a deep fake. She manipulated the video. You cannot trust her, Elias. She is trying to destroy everything we built." Elder Harrison slowly closed the red folder, tucking the USB drive safely inside. He stood perfectly straight, squaring his shoulders, his posture shifting from a betrayed friend to a righteous judge. He looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. There was no pity left in the old man's eyes, only the cold, hard resolve of a shepherd protecting his flock from a wolf. "You built nothing but a monument to your own vanity, Thomas," Elder Harrison boomed, his voice echoing across the patio with terrifying authority. "You have desecrated the house of God. You have stolen from the poor. You have tortured your own flesh and blood, and you have violated the sacred rest of a dead child to cover your financial crimes. You are a disgrace to the cloth." Thomas whimpered, sinking to his knees despite the agents holding his arms. Elder Harrison took a deliberate step forward, raising his voice so the entire neighborhood could hear the final judgment. "Effective immediately by the power vested in me, by the Executive Board of Elders, you are permanently stripped of your pastoral title. You are no longer the shepherd of our church. You are excommunicated, Thomas Adams. You are cast out." The finality of the word hung in the air, heavier than the oppressive summer humidity. To be excommunicated by the very man who had championed his rise was the ultimate, inescapable humiliation. Thomas let out a hollow, agonizing wail, sagging completely into the arms of the federal agents. His expensive suit dragged across the patio stones as they hauled his dead weight toward the waiting SUVs. The local police moved in, simultaneously advancing on Helen. she shrieked, slapping blindly at the female officer who grabbed her wrists. "Do not touch me!" Helen screamed, her pearl necklace snapping in the struggle, sending tiny white beads scattering across the brickwork like hail. "I am the pastor's wife. I demand respect. You cannot do this to me." The officer ignored her protests, efficiently locking the steel cuffs around Helen's wrists and marching her past the horrified staring faces of her former congregation. Chloe watched her parents being dragged away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She clutched her pregnant belly, looking frantically for an escape, but the remaining federal agents were already blocking the side gates. The entire Addams family dynasty, built on decades of manipulation, greed, and stolen money, had been completely dismantled in less than an hour. I stood entirely alone in the center of the ruined patio, completely surrounded by shattered porcelain, spilled barbecue, and scattered pearls. The bright, flashing police lights cast long, erratic shadows across the lawn. The humid air was thick with the scent of trampled flowers and fear. I calmly watched the black SUVs pull away from the curb, carrying the architects of my misery toward their inevitable federal prison sentences. The deep silence that fell over the yard was no longer heavy or oppressive. It felt incredibly clean and wonderfully peaceful. The tranquility lasted exactly 3 seconds before a frantic, high-pitched screech shattered the humid air. The black SUVs carrying my father and Trent had vanished down the street, but the local police cruiser remained idling by the curb. Helen had not yet been fully secured in the back seat. As the female officer moved to guide her head beneath the doorframe, my mother violently twisted her body, using her weight to break free from the officer's grip. The sudden movement sent her stumbling backward, her designer heels catching on the uneven edge of the driveway. Instead of fleeing toward the street, her panicked instincts drove her right back toward the epicenter of her ruined kingdom. She scrambled frantically up the walkway, her breath coming in ragged, hysterical gasps, ignoring the officer's shouting demands for her to halt. She lunged onto the patio, her eyes wild and bloodshot, scanning the space until she locked onto me. The imposing matriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist, who had meticulously curated an image of flawless elegance and unshakable moral superiority, completely disintegrated before my eyes. She did not walk. She practically crawled the last few feet, her knees hitting the hard stone pavers with a sickening thud. The impact tore the fabric of her expensive, custom-tailored Sunday dress, but she did not seem to notice or care. She threw herself forward, her arms wrapping desperately around my lower legs. Her manicured fingers dug into my ankles with a bruising, terrifying strength. Tears streamed down her face, carving thick, muddy tracks through her expensive foundation and smearing her mascara into dark, ugly hollows beneath her eyes. Her perfectly styled hair hung in limp, sweat-soaked strands around her face. She looked up at me, her expression contorted into a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. The realization that her wealth, her status, and her carefully constructed country club facade were entirely gone had finally fractured her mind. She was no longer the untouchable pastor's wife. She was a cornered animal facing the complete annihilation of her identity. "Maya, please!" Helen wailed, her voice cracking into a raw, guttural sob that echoed painfully across the manicured lawn. "Please, baby. You have to stop this. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. We are blood. You are my daughter. I raised you. I gave you everything. Don't let them take me away in front of the neighbors." She buried her face against my shins, weeping with a chaotic, unrestrained intensity that I had never witnessed in my entire life. The sheer volume of her breakdown had drawn an audience. Beyond the wrought iron gates of our sprawling property, the quiet, affluent neighborhood had awakened. Dozens of neighbors, the very same elite socialites, doctors, and lawyers my mother had spent decades trying to impress and intimidate, had stepped out of their pristine homes. They were crowding the property line, their faces pressed near the iron bars. Almost every single one of them held a smartphone, the camera lenses pointed directly at the patio, recording every agonizing second of the great Helen Addams groveling in the dirt. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the sobbing, trembling woman clutching my feet. I felt the heat of her tears soaking through the fabric of my trousers. I searched my heart for a flicker of sympathy, for a single ounce of daughterly affection, but I found absolutely nothing. The well had run completely dry years ago, poisoned by her relentless cruelty, her endless comparisons, and her deliberate efforts to make me feel worthless. She was not crying out of remorse for the money she stole or the lives she ruined. She was only crying because her audience was watching her fall. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her desperate grasping fingers off my ankles, peeling her hands away one by one. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her to fall forward onto her hands. She remained on all fours, trembling violently, her chest heaving as she stared up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "You spent my entire life telling everyone I was the embarrassment of this family," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that carried just enough volume to pierce through her hysterics. "You paraded me around as your greatest failure, a prop to make yourself look more graceful, more resilient, and more perfect. You weaponized shame to control me. But today, Helen, the illusion is completely over. Today I am letting you experience what real embarrassment feels like." Helen let out a sharp, devastated gasp, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to formulate a defense that no longer existed. Before she could lunge for my legs again, the female police officer sprinted onto the patio, her face flushed with anger and exertion. She did not offer any of the gentle deference my mother was accustomed to receiving. The officer grabbed Helen by the upper arm with uncompromising force, hauling her off the stone pavers and dragging her upright. "Do not move again, or I will charge you with resisting arrest," the officer barked, spinning Helen around and forcefully marching her back toward the driveway. Helen stumbled, her ruined dress dragging across the debris of the patio. As the officer pushed her toward the curb, my mother finally noticed the crowd gathered at the fence. She saw the glowing screens of the smartphones, the whispering lips, and the judgmental stares of her peers. The final shreds of her sanity snapped. She began to thrash and kick, screaming hysterically, begging the neighbors to stop filming, begging them to remember who she was. The officer swiftly grabbed the chain of her handcuffs, forcing her head down and shoving her unceremoniously into the cramped, plastic-lined back seat of the police cruiser. The heavy steel door slammed shut instantly, cutting off the agonizing sound of her wailing, leaving only the muffled rhythmic thudding of her forehead, desperately striking against the tinted glass. The red and blue lights of the departing police cruisers washed over the manicured rose bushes, casting long, erratic shadows across the ruined lawn. The chaotic symphony of shouting officers and wailing family members faded down the affluent street, leaving behind a thick, suffocating silence. The sprawling patio, normally a pristine stage for my mother's elaborate social performances, was now a trampled battlefield of shattered porcelain, spilled barbecue sauce, and scattered pearls. I slowly turned my attention back to the center of the yard. Chloe was still standing near the expensive stainless steel outdoor kitchen, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. The arrogant, untouchable smirk that had defined her entire existence was completely gone, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed look of utter shock. Her husband was currently in the back of a federal vehicle. Her parents were in police custody. The elite Addams family dynasty was officially eradicated. She looked around the empty yard, her eyes darting frantically toward the wrought iron gates, as if expecting a servant or a lawyer to suddenly appear and clean up the colossal mess. When no one came to her rescue, her gaze slowly locked onto me. I fully expected her to break down in tears or flee the property in shame. Instead, the deeply ingrained entitlement that our parents had carefully cultivated within her immediately took over. She straightened her posture, smoothing the wrinkled fabric of her expensive designer maternity dress. She marched toward me with the familiar demanding stride of a woman who fully expected the world to instantly bow at her feet and fix her problems. "You are going to help me right now," Chloe demanded, her voice shaking slightly but heavily laced with an absurd amount of authority. "Trent's bank accounts are obviously frozen and I cannot stay in that massive house all by myself with a baby on the way. I have absolutely nothing accessible right now. You need to let me move into your guest house until I can figure out how to handle this absolute disaster." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request. She had just spent the entire afternoon mocking me, laughing as our mother tried to humiliate me, and reveling in the illusion of her superior life. Now, standing completely alone in the ruins of her fraudulent existence, she honestly believed she could simply demand shelter from the very sister she had spent decades actively trying to destroy. "Did you hear what I said, Maya?" Chloe snapped, stepping closer and pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. "I am pregnant. I am under extreme emotional distress. You owe me this much. You set this whole thing up. You brought those federal agents here to ruin us. The absolute least you can do is provide a comfortable roof over my head until Trent's lawyers sort out this ridiculous misunderstanding." I did not blink. I did not step back. I looked at the sister who had happily participated in my emotional execution for years, searching my heart for a single shred of familial obligation. I found absolutely nothing but the cool, refreshing weight of absolute detachment. "I owe you absolutely nothing," I replied, my voice steady and cold enough to freeze the humid summer air. "You are not a victim in this scenario, Chloe. You knew exactly where Trent's endless supply of money was coming from. You happily spent stolen corporate funds to furnish your extravagant nursery and buy your imported luxury cars. You smiled brightly while our parents looted the congregation to fund your lifestyle. You are just upset that the performance is finally over." Chloe let out an exaggerated theatrical sob, immediately attempting to switch her tactics. She cradled her stomach, trying to weaponize her unborn child the exact same way our parents had weaponized their faith. "How can you be so incredibly heartless? I am your sister. I am carrying your nephew. We are blood. You cannot just leave me out on the street to fend for myself." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. The time for polite restraint had expired years ago. "Do not ever use the word family with me again," I warned, my tone slicing cleanly through her fake manipulative tears. "You stood in this very yard and used the memory of my dead child as a punchline. You used my darkest, most agonizing grief as leverage to secure your own financial comfort. You smiled while our mother tried to erase my existence." Chloe opened her mouth to protest, but I raised my hand, silencing her completely. "You are a parasite, Chloe. You have spent your entire life happily feeding off the destruction of others. I will not allow you to attach yourself to me. You will never step foot near my family. You will never see where I live. You are entirely on your own." The harsh reality of my absolute rejection slammed into her. She took a staggering step backward, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She raised her hand, intending to strike me across the face, but before she could swing, a sharp, piercing buzz echoed from the designer handbag slung over her shoulder. The sudden noise startled her. She dropped her hand and frantically unzipped the bag, pulling out her glowing smartphone. I watched her eyes dart rapidly across the illuminated screen. It was an automated text message delivering the cold, impersonal news of absolute financial devastation. Trent had been desperate to cover his massive embezzlement tracks. In his frantic attempt to keep the federal agents at bay, he had secretly taken out heavily leveraged secondary mortgages against their sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. He had used their dream home as collateral for his criminal enterprise without telling her a single word. The message from the primary lender was brutally clear. Due to the immediate freezing of all assets and the federal indictment, all outstanding loans were instantly called due. The bank was initiating emergency foreclosure proceedings. Her keys were useless. Her pristine, professionally decorated nursery was gone. The locks were actively being changed by private security. Chloe let out a sound that did not even resemble a human voice. It was a hollow, suffocating gasp of pure terror. The expensive phone slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the stone patio with a sharp crack, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of broken glass. Her legs simply gave out beneath her. The physical manifestation of her complete ruin brought her crashing down onto the manicured lawn. She collapsed into the damp grass, her expensive maternity dress soaking up the spilled lemonade and mud. She curled her body into a tight, trembling ball, pulling her knees to her chest as she began to hyperventilate. The arrogant, untouchable golden child was reduced to a weeping broken shell, lying in the wreckage of a garden party that had served as the execution block for her entire fake life. I turned my back on her and walked toward the gate, stepping out into the street without looking back. Marcus was leaning against the passenger door of his sedan when I emerged from the estate. He pushed off the dark metal and opened the door for me, his expression softening as he took in my exhausted posture. We drove in silence through the affluent neighborhood, leaving the shattered remnants of my family's fraudulent empire far behind us. The downtown precinct was a stark contrast to the manicured lawns of the suburbs, its harsh fluorescent lights and scuffed linoleum floors buzzing with the chaotic energy of a busy Saturday afternoon. We were immediately escorted past the crowded waiting area and led down a narrow hallway into a private conference room. Detective Harris and Agent Miller were already waiting for us, surrounded by towering stacks of manila folders and digital evidence bags. The air in the room felt heavy with the sheer volume of criminal activity being meticulously catalogued. I sat down next to Marcus, resting my hands flat on the scratched laminate table. For the next 2 hours, we methodically detailed every single aspect of the investigation. We provided the timeline of Trent's corporate embezzlement, the routing numbers connecting the stolen funds to the church, and the undeniable proof of my mother and father using the congregation's tithes as their personal piggy bank. Detective Harris leaned back in his squeaking office chair, rubbing his tired eyes before looking directly at me. He explained that the scale of the financial deception was far worse than we had initially anticipated. My parents had not just been skimming off the top of the building fund, they had been operating a highly sophisticated money laundering ring for over a decade. They had siphoned millions of dollars through fake charitable organizations, phantom missionary funds, and fraudulent tax exemptions. My father had leveraged the absolute trust of his devoted followers to build a massive hidden real estate portfolio across 3 different states. Every single property was registered under obscure shell companies, exclusively managed by Helen. They had completely drained the life savings of their most vulnerable parishioners to maintain an illusion of divine prosperity. The detective stated clearly that they were both looking at decades in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. A sudden violent crash against the drywall interrupted the detective's grim summary. The noise came from the adjoining interrogation room, followed immediately by a frantic, high-pitched voice, desperately pleading with whoever was inside. I recognized that pathetic, trembling tone instantly. It was Trent. The arrogant golden boy who had sneered at me hours ago was now completely unraveling on the other side of the two-way mirror. Agent Miller briefly stepped out of our conference room to check the commotion. When she returned, a sharp, humorless smile played across her lips. There was absolutely no honor among thieves, especially when faced with the terrifying reality of a maximum security federal facility. Trent had lasted exactly 45 minutes before breaking completely. He was currently sobbing across a steel table, furiously trading every ounce of his supposed family loyalty for the vague promise of a lighter sentence. He was offering the FBI unlimited access to the church's hidden financial ledgers, the complex encryption passwords for my father's offshore accounts, and the exact names of the Cayman Island bankers who facilitated the illicit transfers. He threw Thomas and Helen directly under the bus, claiming my father had masterminded the entire operation and manipulated him into laundering the corporate funds. Trent was eagerly painting himself as a naive, coerced victim of a tyrannical pastor, entirely willing to send his father-in-law away for life, just to shave a few years off his own inevitable sentence. He even offered to testify against Chloe, stating she was fully aware of the stolen funds funding their luxurious lifestyle. His cowardly betrayal was the final, fitting testament to the absolute moral bankruptcy of their entire existence. Agent Miller closed her notebook, signaling the end of the formal interview process. She thanked us for our meticulous documentation, acknowledging that Marcus's digital tracking had handed them an airtight case on a silver platter. As we stood up to leave, Detective Harris raised his hand, asking us to wait for just one more moment. He stepped out of the room and returned a minute later carrying a heavy sealed evidence box. My breath caught in my throat. The detective carefully placed the cardboard box on the table and broke the red security seal. He reached inside and gently lifted out the polished bronze urn. It had been recovered from my father's study during the initial raid, dusted for fingerprints, and thoroughly catalogued as part of the desecration charges. The local police had formally released it back into my legal custody. I reached out with trembling hands, my fingertips brushing against the cool, smooth metal. The profound weight of the small vessel grounded me in a way I had not felt since the day I lost my son. The agonizing nightmare of the past few weeks, the relentless manipulation, the cruel gaslighting, the sheer depravity of my parents, violating my child's sacred rest to cover their own greed, was finally over. I pulled the urn firmly against my chest, wrapping both arms around the cool bronze. Marcus stepped close behind me, his strong arms encircling my shoulders, offering a silent, unwavering pillar of support. I leaned back against his chest, closing my eyes, as the sterile environment of the police precinct faded away. A single heavy tear slipped from my eyelashes, tracing a warm path down my cheek before falling onto the polished metal of the urn. I was not crying for my parents facing absolute ruin in the holding cells down the hall. I was not mourning the sister who had happily participated in my destruction. I was shedding a tear of pure, profound relief. My son was finally safe. My family's toxic reign was permanently demolished, and I was entirely free. The long nightmare had ended, leaving me with a beautifully quiet, brilliant new dawn. The weeks following the arrest dragged the Adams family name through the mud with a brutal, relentless efficiency that captivated the entire city. I did not have to actively seek out the updates. The scandal dominated every local news cycle newspaper front page and social media feed in the state. Prominent pastor and finance director arrested in massive dollar fraud became the standard banner scrolling across the bottom of morning broadcasts. Investigative journalists dug into the glamorous lifestyle my parents had flaunted, pulling apart the seams of their offshore accounts and fake charitable organizations. Footage of my father being led out of his megachurch in handcuffs played on a continuous loop. Reporters interviewed devastated parishioners who had donated their retirement funds to Thomas's phantom building projects. The community that had once worshipped my family now demanded blood. Trent's corporate embezzlement scheme was exposed as the sloppy, desperate attempt to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. Financial experts went on television to explain how he had leveraged multiple properties, including Chloe's foreclosed mansion, to cover the gaping holes in his fraudulent ledger. My sister's face captured in frantic paparazzi photos as she fled, her seized property became a cautionary tale of suburban greed. The sheer, unprecedented scale of the financial deception utterly shocked even the most hardened, cynical legal commentators. The prosecution leaked details of Trent's desperate plea deal, confirming he was actively testifying against my father to save himself. The church board officially dissolved the congregation, selling the massive worship center to cover a fraction of the outstanding legal liabilities. Every single asset tied to the prestigious Adams name was immediately frozen, mercilessly seized, or rapidly auctioned off by uncompromising federal authorities. The magnificent kingdom my mother had built on shame and stolen money was reduced to a pile of embarrassing public records and sensationalized headlines. I silently watched the chaotic, embarrassing circus unfold from a brilliant vantage point they never even knew existed. My actual home was not a modest apartment or a struggling artist loft. I stood barefoot on the heated hardwood floors of my opulent city penthouse, located on the very top floor of a sleek glass tower in the heart of the metropolis. Massive windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the skyline, placing me physically and metaphorically above the suburban wreckage of my past. My sanctuary was designed with clean lines, minimalist elegance, and absolute security. The morning sunlight poured across my expansive kitchen island as I poured a fresh cup of coffee, listening to the news anchor detail my parents' denied bail hearings. I felt absolutely no anxiety regarding the federal dragnet sweeping through my family tree. Years ago, when I first began building my design agency, I had anticipated their financial toxicity. Marcus and my dedicated corporate legal team had constructed an impenetrable fortress around my assets, my companies, and my identity. My wealth was diversified across ironclad trusts, international holdings, and legitimate, highly profitable corporate ventures entirely disconnected from the Adams name. I was a ghost in their financial records. When the FBI forensic accountants tore through my father's ledgers and Trent's banking history, they found absolutely nothing tying me to their crimes. I was completely insulated, legally untouchable, and financially secure in a way my parents had only ever pretended to be. I took a sip of my coffee, turning my back on the television screen. The sprawling city below me buzzed with genuine industry and honest ambition. I had built my empire through relentless hard work, sleepless nights, and undeniable talent, completely rejecting the parasitic shortcuts my family had embraced. My staggering success was remarkably real, incredibly tangible, and completely my own creation. I did not have to look over my shoulder, fear audits, or lie to maintain my lifestyle. I possessed the ultimate luxury that my mother and sister would never experience again: absolute peace of mind. The sleek, polished chrome elevator softly chimed, depositing Marcus directly into the quiet serenity of my private foyer. He carried a stack of sorted mail, his expression neutral, as he handed me a single crumpled envelope. The return address belonged to the County Detention Center. The frantic, slanted handwriting scrawled across the front was unmistakably from Helen. She had somehow managed to bypass my unlisted address protocols, likely using her one permitted phone call to harass a former associate into tracking me down. I stared at the cheap paper, feeling the familiar heavy weight of her toxic entitlement radiating from the ink. I deliberately slit the soiled envelope open and slowly unfolded the thin-lined sheet of paper. She did not start with an apology. She did not ask how I was doing or mention the grandchild she had desecrated. The letter immediately launched into a frantic, manipulative demand for salvation. She complained about the terrible food, the lack of respect from the guards, and the horrific conditions of her cell. She insisted that the entire situation was a massive misunderstanding orchestrated by Thomas and Trent, claiming she was merely a devoted wife, completely unaware of the financial logistics. The final paragraph was a direct command. She demanded that I liquidate whatever assets I had, contact her expensive defense attorney, and post her bail immediately. She reminded me of my duty as a daughter, insisting that blood required me to rescue her from this embarrassment. I did not even bother reading the final sentence. The manipulative spell that had controlled my youth was permanently broken. I walked over to the industrial paper shredder sitting discreetly beneath my home office desk. I held the letter over the metal slot, letting the cheap paper slip from my fingers. The machine roared to life instantly, pulling my mother's desperate, arrogant demands into the spinning steel blades. I stood quietly and watched the letter completely disintegrate into a worthless pile of meaningless confetti. I took a deep, steadying breath and smiled as the humming machine finally went silent. My future was bright, lacking room for them. The county detention center smelled of bleach and stale sweat, a harsh contrast to my pristine penthouse. I sat still in the sterile visitation room, staring through the pane of bulletproof glass. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with an irritating hum. My designer suit felt out of place in this bleak purgatory, but I wore it as a deliberate statement. I was not here as a grieving daughter seeking closure. I was here as the architect of their ruin, delivering the inescapable verdict. A heavy steel door clanked open on the opposite side of the partition. A guard escorted my parents into the narrow booth. The sight of Thomas and Helen stripped of their expensive finery was pathetic. They wore faded orange jumpsuits that swallowed their imposing figures. My father's silver hair was a disheveled mess, and his arrogant posture had collapsed into a defeated slouch. My mother looked unrecognizable without her cosmetics. Her skin was sallow, her eyes darted nervously, and her hands trembled as the guard locked her wrists to the metal desk. They fumbled for the heavy black telephone receivers. I calmly lifted mine, pressing the cool plastic to my ear. I did not speak. I watched them squirm under my unwavering gaze. There was no shouting or lingering emotional pain on my end. The well of my empathy was bone dry. I felt only a cold, clinical detachment. "Maya!" Helen whimpered, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. You came. I knew you would read my letter and realize this is a mistake. You have to get us out of here. The food is inedible, the guards are cruel, and these people are animals. Please call the bank. Liquidate whatever you need to and post our bail. Thomas leaned closer to the glass, attempting to summon his pastoral voice. Your mother is right, Maya. You have an obligation to your family. The Lord commands you to honor your father and mother. You need to fix this. Trent lied to federal agents to save his own skin. We are innocent victims of his greed. You have the resources to hire us a real defense team. I let his sermon hang in the air. I did not raise my voice. There is no bail money. I stated my tone like a surgical scalpel. There will be no defense team. I did not come here to rescue you. I came here to ensure you understand exactly how permanent your destruction is. Helen gasped, her pale face pressing closer to the scuffed plexiglass. What are you talking about? We still have the main house. We have the estate. If you just authorize the release of the equity, we can pay for everything. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. You do not have a house, Helen, I replied softly. When the federal authorities seized your assets and froze your accounts, your primary lender initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on the estate. The bank wanted to offload the toxic debt quickly to avoid the public scandal. So I bought it. Thomas's eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. His jaw dropped open as the realization slowly settled over him. I purchased the debt on your foreclosed home through an anonymous corporate proxy. I continued savoring the devastation blooming on their faces. And yesterday morning, I authorized the complete liquidation of the entire property. The mansion has been sold to a commercial developer at a fraction of its value. The rose gardens you loved are being bulldozed this afternoon to make way for a strip mall. Your designer furniture, imported rugs, and ridiculous oil paintings are completely gone. You have absolutely nothing left. No! Helen shrieked, slamming her cuffed hands against the metal desk. You cannot do that. That is our home. That is our legacy. You stole everything from us. I simply took out the trash, I corrected. I reached into my leather briefcase and withdrew a stack of legal documents. I slid the manila folder through the narrow metal slot at the bottom of the security partition. The papers landed with a heavy thud. These are permanent, non-negotiable restraining orders, I explained. They prohibit you from ever contacting me, coming near my home, or attempting to reach out to my business associates. If you mail me another letter, the warden will revoke your commissary privileges. If you attempt to call me through a proxy, you will face additional harassment charges. We are legally, financially, and permanently severed. Thomas frantically clawed at the documents. Maya, you cannot abandon us. What about Chloe? Your sister needs help. Trent left her with nothing. You have to take care of her. She is carrying your own flesh and blood. I looked at my father with profound disgust. Chloe is experiencing the exact life you always thought I deserved, I said. She currently lives in a damp studio apartment on the wrong side of the city. Her husband is going to federal prison and her reputation is toxic, so no reputable company will hire her. Your precious golden child is working a minimum wage shift at a roadside diner. She spends 10 hours a day scrubbing tables to afford her basic groceries. She is finally learning what it means to struggle entirely on her own. Helen began to hyperventilate, tears streaming down her sallow cheeks. She clawed frantically at the thick, bulletproof glass, her mouth open in a silent scream of pure agony. The golden dynasty she had built was completely erased. They were penniless, humiliated, and destined to die behind bars. I did not offer them another single word. I calmly placed the black receiver back onto the metal hook, cutting off their frantic, begging voices. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. I turned my back on the glass, completely ignoring the desperate pounding of their fists against the partition. I pushed open the heavy steel door and walked straight out into the bright sunshine, leaving the architects of my misery rotting behind. The heavy steel doors of the county detention center sealed shut behind me, cutting off the muffled, frantic screams echoing from the visitation booth. I stepped out into the crisp, unfiltered afternoon air, taking a deep and deliberate breath. The oppressive, sterile stench of bleach and desperation instantly vanished, replaced by the invigorating scent of rain-washed pavement, and absolute freedom. I walked toward the waiting black car, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the concrete. Marcus stood by the open door, his eyes scanning my face for any lingering traces of sorrow. He found none. I slid into the leather seat, the engine humming to life, carrying me far away from the wreckage of the Adams dynasty and toward the beautiful horizon we had painstakingly built together. 2 weeks later, the urban skyline of the city was nothing more than a glittering, distant mirage. The gentle, rhythmic swaying of our private yacht replaced the chaotic vibrations of the corporate world. We were miles off the coast, surrounded by an endless, untouched expanse of deep, sapphire water. The sun was beginning its slow descent, bleeding brilliant shades of gold, crushed violet and burnt orange across the cloudless sky. The warm ocean breeze caught the edges of my flowing white linen dress, wrapping around me like a protective, welcoming embrace, as the first few stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. I stood barefoot on the polished teak deck, feeling completely untethered from the heavy, suffocating gravity of my past. There were no cameras here, no judgmental congregations, no manipulative family members waiting to tear me down. There was only the vast open ocean, the steady presence of my husband, and the profound, unshakable peace we had finally earned. Marcus walked up behind me, his footsteps silent on the smooth wood. He held the heavy bronze urn in his hands, cradling it with the utmost reverence and care. He stopped at my side, our shoulders touching, offering a silent transfer of strength. I reached out, resting my hands over his, feeling the cool metal warming beneath our combined touch. We stood together at the stern of the vessel, looking out over the churning wake trailing behind us. This was not a moment of grief. We had already shed our tears in the dark, desperate hours of the past. This was a moment of pure, profound reclamation. I unfastened the latch, lifting the lid of the urn. The ocean breeze immediately caught the edges of the opening. "No one will ever disturb you again, my sweet boy," I whispered, my voice steady and filled with fierce, unwavering maternal love. "You are completely free. You are entirely safe." Together, Marcus and I tilted the bronze vessel forward. The pale gray ashes caught the golden light of the setting sun, swirling upward in a beautiful, ethereal dance, before settling gently onto the surface of the restless water. They drifted outward, carried away by the powerful, untouchable currents of the deep ocean. I watched them go, feeling a massive, invisible weight finally lift from my chest. My son was no longer confined to a dark study in a house built on fraud. He was part of the boundless, eternal sea, surrounded by a peace that Helen and Thomas could never reach, manipulate, or desecrate. Marcus set the empty urn on the deck and wrapped his arms securely around my waist, pulling my back against his chest. We stood in comfortable, absolute silence, watching the water absorb our precious child, committing him to the ultimate protected rest. A soft, discreet buzz broke the tranquility. It was coming from the small glass table near the lounge chairs, where I had carelessly tossed my phone hours ago. I did not rush to answer it. The urgency that used to dictate my life, the desperate need to constantly prove my worth, was completely gone. I slowly walked over to the table, picking up the device. The screen illuminated, displaying a high-priority encrypted alert from my lead corporate attorney. I swiped open the message, my eyes scanning the brief, highly anticipated text. The private equity firm I had built from the ground up had just officially closed its latest, most aggressive acquisition to date. We had successfully executed a hostile takeover of a massive multinational real estate conglomerate. The wire transfers had cleared, the contracts were fully executed, and the board of directors had been entirely replaced by my own hand-picked team. My net worth, already staggering, had just multiplied exponentially. The empire I had forged in absolute secrecy, fueled by the very ambition my parents had tried to crush, was now an unstoppable global force. I locked the screen and tossed the phone back onto the table with a quiet, satisfied laugh. The staggering accumulation of wealth and power was undeniable, but the money itself was no longer the primary objective. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of my autonomy. It was the armor that ensured no one would ever have the power to belittle, control, or discard me again. I had taken the shattered, rejected pieces of the family scapegoat and forged them into an unbreakable titanium shield. I walked back to the edge of the deck, returning to my husband. Marcus reached out, pulling me close against his side. He leaned down, pressing a warm, lingering kiss against my forehead. He did not need to ask about the notification. The confident, radiant smile spreading across my face told him everything he needed to know. The bitter, frightened girl who used to cower under her mother's vicious criticism was completely dead, buried alongside the toxic legacy of the Addams family name. I leaned my head against Marcus's shoulder, looking out at the brilliant, burning horizon. The ocean breeze whipped through my hair, carrying the scent of salt and absolute victory. The scapegoat didn't just survive. She bought the slaughterhouse. The golden sun finally dipped below the water, and the world faded into a beautiful, triumphant black.